Facilitating speaker this morning, Brother Giles Amos from Dovercourt Congregation. And his talk is entitled, Your Future, How Can It Be Known? So an intriguing title, and you've got our attention, Brother Amos.
I want you to listen to this statement very carefully. A pope will be assassinated when the rose flowers. A pope will be assassinated when the rose flowers. That statement was uttered by the 16th century futurist Nostradamus, and it was said to have fulfillment in May 1981, when there was an attempt on the life of the then Pope John Paul II. This, wait for it, this coincided, according to those that predicted it, or rather predicted the fulfillment, when the rose flowered. That was, according to the interpreters, when the Socialist Party under François Mitterrand came to power. Would you believe it? The emblem of the Socialist Party was the rose. Tenuous somewhat. Anyway, the interest generated by this utterance in the following year led to 232,000 copies of Nostradamus' writings translated into French being sold in only a few months. What does it show? What does it illustrate? Really, that people are interested in understanding their future. Not just their future, the future of the nation where they live, the future of the world. And when you think about it, knowing the future has consumed people from various different backgrounds of life, from the housewife, maybe reading her stars in the daily newspaper, or the presidents or kings of various world powers throughout history. Many, though, we have to say, are disappointed by the efforts of these so-called futurists. They're disappointed because we're imperfect. Mankind can never tell the future. And if you think about it, prophets have come and gone making wide proclamations of what's going to happen, and unfortunately, they're totally wrong. Let's think, for example, just back, 10, 12 years, the financial crash. Think of the millions that were spent on advisors thinking, well, we can work out exactly what's going to happen from a financial point of view, and of course being disappointed. Of the 946 predictions made by Nostradamus, apparently, according to McClintock and Strong, 70 had a tenuous fulfillment. In fact, most of them were bold forgeries, according to that source. However, there is a book of predictions, prophecies, if you like, written over 1,600 years ago by 40 different writers, which can accurately foretell the future. Skeptics have suggested that, yes, it's a good book of morals. And the older part, well, it's a bit of a history of an ancient people. Others have said it's very clever, but it contradicts itself. But when you compare it with other writings, contemporary writings, there's no comparison. No comparisons at all. And the amazing thing about these prophecies or predictions, as Bible students, we know when examining them closely, deal specifically with events which could never have been manipulated by mankind. Specific events, ones which we're not necessarily talking about today, but some, like, for example, pinpointing World War I are mentioned in some of those scriptures. The book we're talking about, of course, is the Bible. Now, if you're a Bible student or you are someone looking into it, I think you might enjoy this talk, because it's quite amazing how Bible prophecy is going to be of interest to you now and, of course, the future. The amazing thing about this particular book is that its author, Jehovah God, wants us to understand what's going to happen in the future. He's not hidden it by any means. And if you were to look at a scripture in Isaiah 42, notice in verse 9 what it says about him. It says, "See, the first things have come to pass. Now I'm declaring new things." And note this, "Before they spring up, I tell you about them."
Oh.
So he's allowing his followers to understand what's going to happen in the future.
Mm.
So without steamrolling through hundreds of prophecies this morning, we're just going to examine one which has real relevance to our day, ultimately, and also the long-term future. Now, if you like history, I think you might like this talk, because history and prophecy, Bible prophecy, go hand in hand. And as we see through this talk, quite closely, secular history actually proves the Bible as being correct.
Mm.
So which Bible book are we going to refer to? It's the Bible book of Daniel, and specifically Daniel chapter 2.
Ah.
Daniel chapter 2. So if you like to get your Bibles open to Daniel chapter 2.
That's the one.
Before our eyes, we're going to see step-by-step details of history unfolding, particularly from a governmental or political standpoint.
Mm.
Now, at this point, we need to stress there's been many political powers that have gone through history. But the political powers mentioned in this particular chapter are all relating in some way or affected in some way God's people, either through a nation or, as we'll go through the talk, as individuals throughout the world in these last days.
Mm.
So I want you to imagine the scene. Can you see it in Daniel chapter 2? A very powerful king, mentioned in verse 1 as Nebuchadnezzar. Notice it says that he's in the second year of his kingship. Well, actually, that's the second year after he's actually overthrown the nation of Israel. It's his 20th regnal year, just for some who want a little bit of detail there. It's a palace scene, court scene. He's got wine, he's got wealth, he's got opulence. He's got everything he wants. However, he's disturbed. He's troubled. You can see that he's troubled because he can't sleep. He's agitated. These dreams that he's having are such an agitation because he doesn't know what they mean. But the worst thing of it, he can't remember what the dream's about. So what does he do? Well, being an all-powerful king, he has various men who work for him, civil servants, if you like, wise men, priests, magic practicing priests as they're called, or sorcerers as well, that will help give that interpretation, he thinks. And he's a man who always gets his own way by the sounds of it. If you look to verse 5, he says that basically if they don't interpret the dream, what's going to happen to these wise men? Well, they'll be dismembered, and their houses will basically be turned into toilets. So you would think there would be a little bit of panic in the court, wouldn't you? Now, Daniel, as some of us know, and his companions, 3 companions, actually work for this particular king. They're civil servants, if you like. They're in the palace area, and they're classed as the wise men. So basically, if Daniel or his companions can't interpret those dreams, he likewise will have the same fate as those other magic practicing priests and wise men. Notice if you look down to verse 14, the difference between him, Daniel, and those magic practicing priests. It says, at the time, Daniel discreetly and cautiously spoke to Arioch, the chief of the king's bodyguard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He asked Arioch, the officer of the king, "Why is there such a harsh order from the king?" And then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So that was the situation. He didn't panic in any way at all. He was calm, wasn't he? Like I say, now he was classed as one of the wise men, so he was going to lose his life also. But do you notice what Daniel did in verse 18? he asked them to pray for mercy from the God of heaven concerning the secret, so that Daniel and his companions would not be destroyed along with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So he didn't try and concoct a story. You can imagine the wise men, the magic practicing priests, trying to think, my goodness, what can we think of to appease the king? No, Daniel didn't do that in any way. In fact, if we go on to verse 24, he says he will go to the king. Arioch, the chief bodyguard, would take him to the king and make known the interpretation. But you notice in verse 28 where Daniel says he gets the influence, or like the power, to be able to reveal the dream and its interpretation. And this is the key, really, to our talk today. That there is a God in the heavens who is a revealer of secrets. And note, he is made known. He is made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what is to happen. And this is the interesting bit for us. In the final part of the days, and then he goes on to interpret the dream. Well, first of all, he gives the reminder to Nebuchadnezzar what the dream is. Note in verse 31, you, O king, were watching, and you saw an immense image. That image, which was huge and extremely bright, was standing in front of you, and its image was terrifying. The head of that image was of fine gold. Its chest and its arms were of silver. Its abdomen and its thighs were of copper. Its legs were of iron, and its feet were part of iron and partly of clay. So what did he look like? I wonder if we could have the picture put up, please. There he is. Now, obviously, he's not a literal man, but he's made up of these different metals. So with that in mind, if we could have the picture down now, we have now the interpretation. You can almost see on Nebuchadnezzar's face, that's what it was about. Yeah, I remember now. But what does it mean? Well, Daniel goes on with Jehovah's help in verse 36 to give the interpretation. This is the dream, and he will now tell the king its interpretation. Verse 37, you, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the might, the strength, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given men, wherever they may dwell, as well as the beasts of the field and the birds of the heavens, and whom he has made ruler over all of them. What a mouthful, isn't it? You yourself are the head of gold. So, the head of gold referred to Nebuchadnezzar as king of Babylon. Does secular history prove that Babylon was in fact a power, a big power, a power that could be reckoned as a world power? Well, according to secular history, Babylon came really to the zenith of their power in 632 BCE, when they overthrew the then world power Assyria at that particular time. And the influence over the Jews, of course, as they overthrew Jerusalem in 607 BCE. And then for about 100 years, and a succession of about 3 kings, Babylon proved to be powerful. Just a little word of caution here in verse 39. We could think, well, is that just referring to Nebuchadnezzar? Because he said, you yourself are the head of gold. Well, if we look in verse 39 and look at the next world power to follow, we can see that that's not the case. Because he says, but after you, another kingdom, not king, kingdom will follow or rise. Who is that, by the way? Who is that kingdom? Well, it's the dual world power of the Medes and the Persians. And many of us perhaps have understood as Bible students in Isaiah how that kingdom was to take Babylon out in one night. Amazingly enough as well, it was predicted who the individual would be, a man called Cyrus. So Daniel didn't know the name of that world power, but he, again, being a very good Bible student, would have undoubtedly read that scroll of Isaiah. Now, interestingly enough, when Cyrus did come to power, he was quite taken by the fact that he was mentioned in Jewish Bible prophecy there. And because he had a huge influence on the nation of Israel, because he allowed 2 years later for the Israelites to go back to their homeland, Israel, Jerusalem. Go back to verse 39, and you notice there, then another kingdom, a third one of copper that will rule the whole earth. Well, what kingdom or government, world power, would follow the Medes and the Persians? Well, it wouldn't be quite as quick a overnight, if you like, appearance of this new world power. But over a period of a few decades, a power, well, actually it worked out more than a few decades, nearly 100 years, gradually on the scene, another power made its head, if you like, visible. And this is the amazing thing again about the Bible. If you was to refer to the same book in Daniel chapter 8, if you like to see in Daniel chapter 8, we can see the identification of that world power written 200 years in advance. Absolutely amazing. Have a look in chapter 8, and Daniel in Daniel chapter 8 sees an unusual scene. He sees a ram with two horns at a waterhole. And at that waterhole, along with the ram, a hairy he-goat, a male hairy he-goat turns up. And this is conspicuous by the fact that he's got this huge horn between its eyes. And the goat actually attacks this ram, and he kills it. But after he kills it, the horn of that hairy he-goat is broken, and four little horns appear. What does it mean? Well, Daniel gives the interpretation in verse 20. This is amazing. The two-horned ram that you saw stands for the kings of Media and Persia. They are the two we mentioned just before, the silver breast, the arms. The hairy male goat stands for the king of Greece. Now, we could say Daniel got away with it, if you like, in verse 20, because, of course, when he wrote this, probably Darius the Mede was in power and he was working for him at that particular time. But he couldn't get away with this one, could he, in verse 21? The king of Greece. And note, the great horn that was between his eyes stands for the first king. Who was that, according to history? Alexander the Great. 332 BCE, the great horn, the first king, Alexander the Great, made his presence felt. And he swept through the region at that particular time. But did you notice in verse 22, it says, and as for the horn that was broken, so that four stood up instead of it, there are four kingdoms from his nation that will stand up, but not with his power. Well, after all-conquering Alexander took the last power, or the last towns, if you like, the regions that the Medes and the Persians had, he died 9 years later in 323 BC of malaria, would you believe it? What happened after a period of 20 years and lots of squabbling with illegitimate children trying to take the throne? After 20 years or so, four generals, obviously with less power, took on the kingships, if you like, of Greece. And there was a fragmentation of the Greek Empire. Interesting enough, we'll go back to Daniel chapter 2 and see who followed Greece. And we're on verse 40 now. Verse 40. Where it says, as for the fourth kingdom, it will be strong like iron. For just as iron crushes and pulverizes everything, yes, like iron that shatters, it will crush and shatter all of these. Who followed Greece? Well, during the 2nd century BCE, an iron-like power started to influence history in such a marked way. And even up to this point, we are influenced by this power. How did it affect God's people? Well, in 63 BCE, Jerusalem had fallen. And, of course, the Jews were like in a vassal-like state, weren't they, under this particular power. The last Greek stronghold in 30 BCE had gone, and 55 BCE, even Britain was conquered. And by 40 CE, Britain totally was under the influence of this particular world power. I shouldn't say Wales or Scotland, this was England rather at this particular point. Again, the dealings with God's people, they were the chief executioners in 33 CE of course Jesus Christ, although it's heavily influenced by the Jews. 64 CE, lots of dates coming out. Nero, the emperor there, really started to attack the Christians, the early Christians now, who were representatives of God on earth, blaming them because of the fire of Rome, of course. 70 CE, Jerusalem itself was destroyed by this world power. Rome. Very iron-like, if you like. Very apt description of Rome itself as this world power. Remember, we're down into the legs, the bottom of the legs now. Now, we're coming down towards the bottom of this particular image, and you notice there's not a clear demarcation as we're heading towards the feet. The iron is going towards the feet. And really, when we think of how the Roman Empire actually fragmented, how it started to lose its power, it was, yes, from a militaristic point of view. In fact, very quickly, Rome itself in Italy wasn't the base where, of course, the Roman Empire still had influence. It was Constantinople. And talking about Constantinople, by 311 CE, Constantine, an emperor, recognized that he couldn't keep at bay the various barbarians who were taking on part of the Roman Empire at the fringes of its empire. So what did he do? Clever man, very clever man. By setting up what we call a tithing system or the feudal system, he set up what we know now as the Holy Roman Empire. And what he did, he mixed pagan ideas along with Christian ideas and set up what was to be known as the Roman Catholic Church, where those within that empire would have to pay a tithe, a wage towards keeping the Roman Empire, if you like, influencing its particular colonies. And this made it very powerful, very powerful. Constantine himself, there's all sorts of interesting thoughts about how he became a Christian, but he set himself up as the first pope, contrary to public opinion, calling himself Pontifex Maximus. Now, as we go through the decades, the centuries, towards the 20th century, just before that, we can see that one of the colonies of Rome started to take a visual impact on the world scene, so as to speak. And it really started off with one man, a man called, if you know your history, Henry VIII, 1533, when he wanted to, of course, divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Of course, Britain at that time was a Catholic country. But he wanted to break free, not necessarily from the Catholic faith, but from his wife, so he could marry Anne Boleyn, which meant he would go against the Pope or the Catholic Church. He did. He set up the Church of England, stopped paying money to Rome, and Britain became quite a powerful nation. And by 1763, their navy was very, very powerful. So we're heading right the way down towards the feet. As we say, we're in the feet now. Britain is very powerful. So logically, reaching the feet, we would mean we'd be really living at a time when the last vestige of human rule will be existing. Because if you look at verse 42, you can see what actually happened with the power of Britain and who was to be his partner, what type of power it would be. Because as for the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom will be partly strong and partly fragile. Just as you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, they will be mixed together with people. But no, they will not stick together, one to the other, just as the iron does not mix with clay. So as stated, Britain was dominant through the colonization, but North America, interestingly enough, was allowed to grow mighty by the British naval power. So by 1914, yes, Britain had the largest empire, but the United States had the largest was classed as the largest industrial power. And then there was this forging of alliances which emerged. And by 1917, the US became the dominant partner. So the UK and the USA became, if you like, the feet. But as you notice, we said earlier, there was a non-mixing of elements, the iron and clay. What does the clay represent? Well, the clay represents elements within this particular world power, which weakened its structure, its iron-like structure. The civil rights movements, the unions, the independence, all these things made it difficult to implement laws without their leaders having clear mandate. And haven't we seen that right up to this day, where there's been there's a split, isn't there? And things are not done because we're living in a democracy as such within these powers. But of course we know things don't go through. The legislation isn't passed easily. But we're not particularly interested in what man does, because notice verse 44 and 45. This is what we've really all been waiting for. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And this kingdom will not be passed on to any other people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, and it alone will stand forever. Just as you saw that out of the mountain the stone was cut not by hands, and that it crushed the iron, the copper, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the grand God has made known to the king what will happen in the future. And this is the good bit. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. So the destruction of not just the kingdoms in this image, but all of the kingdoms of the world, according to other verses, one in Revelation 16, where the kings are all gathered at the word called Armageddon, this will be the end. This stone already heading towards the feet, the weak spot of that image, will soon enact a quite momentous time. So what will follow? It will be a new world government. A government where there will be delightful to live in. A government where there will be peace, perfect peace. The manifesto of that government, the promises that that government are going to bring are going to be amazing. Have a look at Psalm 72. Psalm 72. And look at these promises that are going to come about. Verse 7. In his days the righteous will flourish, and peace will abound until the moon is no more. Yes, peace. Peace until the moon. The moon's always going to be here, so it's going to be forever from that time onwards. And what about the fact that is there going to be enough food to eat? Of course there is. In verse 16 it says there'll be abundance of grain on the earth. On top of the mountains it will overflow. So no resident will be hungry. What about sickness? Will we be, yes, it's all very well having plenty of food, but will we be healthy? Again, a scripture in Isaiah says that no resident will say that I am sick. And what about this thought in Revelation 21? Revelation 21. And in verse 4, what a lovely time where Jehovah God promises, and he will wipe out every tears from their eyes, and death will be no more. Neither will mourning, nor outcry, nor pain be any more, for the former things have passed away. What a wonderful future we have to look forward to, isn't it? So it's time for us really to show we believe in the prophecies of the Bible. We're not interested in the unreliable false prophets of this system. We actively need to put faith in the God, Jehovah, the God who is really the revealer of secrets, where we have a real future, an eternal future, a positive future, which is going to be wonderful for all people who follow the law or the admonitions seen in the scriptures. We want to be part of that future. We can be part of that future if we put faith in Jehovah God.
Thank you very much for that talk, Brother Amos. You clearly demonstrate there's only a single source of truth for the future. It's always good and encouraging to see how secular history backs up Bible prophecy. So we thank you for your obvious hard work you put into that talk.